The paper was sitting on the oak table when I got back, and it had a different number on it. Not a different total, a different owner. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I am not a woman who gets surprised easily. 51 years old, 25 of them in this country, laying block, pouring slab, signing my name on documents I read twice before I sign them once. I have been lied to by inspectors, by clients, by a man I was married to for 19 years, and by at least 4 men I once called Socio, partner. I thought I had run out of ways to be surprised. I was wrong. But I'll get to that. First, you need to see the table, because everything in this story happens around it, or because of it, or in spite of it. And if you don't understand what that table means to me, you won't understand why I did what I did when I found that paper on it. It's oak, roble, almost 2 meters long, heavy enough that it took 4 men to carry it up the stairs into my office in Vallecas. And even then, Miguelín, my foreman, the only man in this story I never had to double check, put his back out for a week doing it. I bought that table in 2009, with the first real money I ever made in Spain that wasn't going straight back out the door to rent or debt or my ex-husband's lawyer. I bought it before I bought a decent car, before I bought anything for myself actually, in 8 years of being in this country. My accountant at the time, a nervous little man named Casals, who is dead now, God rest him, told me I was being sentimental, that a folding table from an office supply warehouse would do the same job for 1/10 of the price. I told him the job wasn't just holding paper. And I'll tell you now, so you're not left wondering while I tell you the rest. By the end of this, I had the last card again.
I usually do, one way or another. Ask anyone who's ever tried to take something from me. But this time, the price of holding that card was higher than anything Fernando ever cost me. And there's a part of this story I still don't know the ending to, not even today, writing this at the same table where it all started. Before I go on, tell me in the comments, has this ever happened to you or to someone you know? A partner, a family member, someone you trusted with something you built, who decided one day that your name on the paper mattered less than theirs did. I suspect more of you know this story from the inside than I'd guess. I was a concrete woman before I was anything else. 25 years old, landed at Barajas with $200 folded into my sock because my mother told me that's where thieves don't look, and a phone number for a cousin of a cousin who ran a construction crew out near Getafe. I didn't speak the Spanish they speak here. I spoke the Spanish they speak in Cali, which is its own thing, faster, softer in some places and harder in others. And for the first year, men on the site would slow down when they talked to me, like I was a child. I let them. You learn faster if you let people underestimate you. That's not bitterness, that's just arithmetic. I mixed cement for 2 years before anyone let me near a level or a plumb line. I want to be precise about that, because young men write to me now. I have a channel, some of you know this, some of you are new. Young men write to me asking how long before they can call themselves something other than a laborer, and I tell them the honest answer, which nobody wants to hear. It takes as long as it takes. And the men who ask that question are usually not ready yet, because the ones who are ready are too busy working to ask. 2 years mixing, then 4 years pouring, framing, learning where water goes when you don't want it to, which is the entire secret of this profession, by the way. Water always wants to go somewhere, and your whole job is deciding where before it decides for you. Then I was a capataz, a forewoman, for a company that built apartment blocks in the south of Madrid. Ugly, fast buildings for people who needed somewhere fast and ugly to live. And I ran crews of men twice my age who called me jefecita behind my back, half mockery, half respect, until they stopped saying it like a joke. My first winter in Madrid, I lived in a room I shared with 3 other Colombian men in a piso in Aluche. One bathroom, a kitchen that smelled permanently of whatever the man from Cucuta was frying at whatever hour he'd finished his shift.
And I remember the cold more than almost anything else from those first months. A cold that had nothing to do with the actual temperature and everything to do with being 25 years old, alone, a small son back with his grandmother in Cali because I hadn't yet saved enough to bring him over, in a city where I didn't understand half of what people said to me, and the half I did understand was usually someone telling me to hurry up. The cousin of a cousin who got me my first job, a man named Norberto, who I haven't spoken to in 15 years, and think about more than that number would suggest, taught me the only thing that actually mattered in that first year, which had nothing to do with construction technique. He taught me to watch before I ever opened my mouth. Watch which foreman actually knew what he was doing and which one was performing knowledge for the site manager's benefit.
Watch which subcontractors paid on time and which ones needed a man standing at their office door on a Friday to remind them a debt existed. Watch before you trust, because in a country where you have no family, no history, no name anyone recognizes, watching is the only capital you start with that nobody can take from you. I brought Sebastian over in 2002, once I had enough saved and a piso of my own. Small, 1-bedroom that we shared. Him on a mattress on the floor of my room for 2 years until I could afford better. He was 2 years old and cried for his abuela in Cali for months. And I remember standing outside the guarderia those first weeks, watching this small, serious boy through the window, already too quiet for his age, in a country whose language he was only beginning to hold on to.
And I thought that whatever I built in Spain, it had better be worth what it was costing him. Because a child doesn't choose to be uprooted. A mother chooses it for him. And a mother owes that child forever after proof that the uprooting meant something. That's a debt I've been paying my whole life, one contract at a time, whether Sebastian or Valentina ever asked me to or not. Then, in 1998, no, that's not right. Let me say the years correctly, because precision is the only thing I have to offer you that a scripted actor reading somebody's fiction can't. I landed in Spain in 2001. I was mixing cement by 2002, on scaffolding by 2004, forewoman by 2006. In 2008, while everyone with sense was watching the Spanish construction industry catch fire and burn to the ground around them, you remember, if you're old enough, the crisis, the cranes that stopped turning overnight, entire developments left half-built with the rebar rusting out of the concrete like broken bones through skin. In 2008, I signed my first contract as a contratista. My own business, 2 employees, a hand tool truck I bought with a loan co-signed by a man I am not going to name because he asked me not to, years ago. And I keep my word about small things, because that's usually all keeping your word costs you. Everyone told me I was insane. Starting a construction business in the middle of the worst construction collapse in Spanish history? And they were right, technically. It was insane. But here is the thing nobody who hasn't done it understands. When a whole industry is on fire, the ones who know how to actually build something Not flip it, not finance it, not draw pretty renderings of it, but build it with their hands correctly so it doesn't fall down. Those people become rare. Rare builders get paid. I did small jobs nobody wanted, reinforcing foundations that other companies had poured wrong and abandoned, rescuing half-finished houses for families who'd lost their original contractor to bankruptcy. I was not proud work in those years. I was necessary work. There's a difference, and if you're young, learn it now. Necessary pays the rent when proud is still waiting for its invoice. By 2009, I had that table.
4 employees, a small office that was really just a room above a ferreteria, a hardware shop in Vallecas, and this oak table that cost more than I could afford, that I bought anyway because I needed one object in my life that told the truth about what I'd already survived. My husband at the time, I'll get to Carlos, we were still married then, still mostly happy, or what I understood happiness to be at 29 years old with 2 babies and no sleep. My husband thought I was foolish. Un capricho, he called it, a whim. He wasn't wrong that it cost too much. He was wrong about why I bought it. I didn't buy that table because I wanted to feel rich. I bought it because I wanted something in my office heavier than any decision anyone could make about me while I wasn't in the room. Remember that sentence. It matters later. By 2018, Sebastian was 18, already drawing buildings in the margins of his math homework, already better with a pencil than I've ever been with anything. By 2018, I had 14 people on payroll, a turnover a little north of 2 million euros a year, and enough saved that I did something that still, honestly, surprises me when I think about it. I bought the building. Not rented, bought. A 3-story former textile warehouse in Vallecas, with bones good enough to convert, cheap enough that a bank actually believed a Colombian immigrant with a construction company could carry the mortgage, which, believe me, was its own small miracle, involving a banker named Ordóñez, who I will also not forget. In a good way this time. I moved the oak table into the new office myself. Refused help. Miguelín offered. I said no. Some things a woman carries herself, even when her back tells her not to, because the carrying is the point. The table sits in the center of my office now.
Not against a wall, not in a corner where a desk is supposed to hide someone from the door. Center of the room, so that anyone who walks in has to walk around it to reach me, and so that I can see the door and the street below the window and everything in between all at the same time from where I sit. I built a construction company on a foundation of not being surprised by anything and being able to see the whole room. That's why what happened on that table broke something in me that a lot of worse things over 25 years never managed to touch.
Let me tell you about Fernando. Fernando Ibáñez. Civil engineer, Madrid-born, 3rd generation in a family that had been doing something adjacent to construction. First stone quarrying, then material supply. Then, by Fernando's generation, the softer end of the business. Relationships, permits, the golf course conversations that get a company on the shortlist for a public tender before the tender is even published. I met him in 2017 at a Chamber of Commerce dinner I only went to because a client insisted, and I hated those dinners the way I hate all rooms where the wine is better than the concrete anyone in the room has ever poured. Fernando found me by the bar, told me he'd heard about the school renovation I'd finished 2 months ahead of schedule in Carabanchel, and said something that I still remember word for word, because it was true, and because true things said to me by strangers are rare enough that I keep them. He said, "Everyone in this room can get a contract. Almost nobody in this room can finish one." I liked him. I want to be honest about that, all the way through this story, because it would be easy for me to tell it now like I always had my doubts, like some instinct in my gut was screaming from day one and I ignored it for money. That's not what happened. What happened is I liked him, genuinely, for almost 5 years. He was funny in the particular dry way that some madrileños are funny, never smiling when he made the joke, waiting a beat to see if you'd catch it. He was good with clients in a way I have never been and never will be. I know this about myself, un poco seca, dry, direct in a way that reads as cold to people who grew up in rooms softer than mine. Fernando could sit across from a city council procurement officer for 2 hours and make the man feel like the smartest, most reasonable person in Madrid. And somewhere in that conversation, the contract terms would shift 0.5% in our favor, and the official would leave the lunch thinking it was his idea. We formed a UTE together in 2019. For those of you outside Spain, a Unión Temporal de Empresas, a temporary business union, is how 2 or more companies join forces to bid on a public contract too large for either to take alone, or too specialized, needing his relationships and my execution both in the same room. It's a real legal structure, filed with the tax authority, with its own tax ID, its own bank account, its own governing agreement, the Acuerdo de UTE, that spells out in notarized language who owns what percentage, who has authority to sign what, who is liable for what if the whole thing collapses.
Ours was Ibáñez y Morales UTE. 60% his company, 40% mine, because he brought the relationship that got us the tender, and I brought the 14 men and the machinery and 25 years of not letting buildings fall down. Before the market contract, Fernando and I had already built 2 smaller projects together under a looser arrangement. Not a formal UTE, just a subcontracting relationship where his firm handled the public-facing side of a job and mine handled execution. The first was a small library renovation in Carabanchel in 2018. Unremarkable, except for one afternoon I still remember clearly, because it was the afternoon I decided I could trust this man with something bigger.
We'd hit a problem 3 weeks into the library job, a structural issue nobody had caught in the original survey, a load-bearing wall that turned out to be doing considerably more work than the drawing suggested, and fixing it correctly meant telling the city we needed 6 more weeks and 11,000 euros more than the contract allowed for. Most partners in Fernando's position would have wanted to hide it, patch it, get through the inspection, and let it become someone else's problem in 10 years. Fernando didn't.
He sat with me in the city's technical office for 2 hours, walked them through the discrepancy himself, took what felt to me at the time like genuine professional embarrassment at having missed it in the original survey, and got the change order approved without a single day of the delay penalty being applied, because he made the city believe, correctly as far as I could tell, that we were the contractor protecting them from a problem, not the contractor who'd caused one. I remember thinking, driving home that night, that I'd finally found a Spanish partner who understood the same thing I'd built my whole company around, that the truth, delivered early and completely, costs less than a lie discovered late.
I told Elena about it the next week, practically glowing, this uncharacteristic enthusiasm from a woman she'd represented through a divorce and 11 years of contract disputes. And she told me, gently, the way she tells me things she thinks I need to hear twice. Me alegro, Andrea, pero un buen socio en un proyecto no es lo mismo que un buen socio para siempre. Sigue firmando como si algún día pudiera cambiar. I'm glad, Andrea. But a good partner on one project isn't the same as a good partner forever. Keep signing like he might change one day. I heard her. I want to be clear that I heard her, and that the poder I signed with Covadonga years later, narrow and specific, was exactly me continuing to heed that advice even as I let Fernando further and further into my professional life. I trusted him with more responsibility every year. I never trusted him with less documentation.
Those two things lived in me at the same time for 5 years, and I used to think that was a contradiction. Now I know it was the only reason I survived what came next. The night we found out we'd won the tender, Fernando took me and Miguelín to a restaurant near Retiro he'd been talking about for weeks, insisted on paying, and stood up halfway through dinner with a glass of wine to say a few words, the way people in that world of his always seem ready to do, comfortable with the room's attention in a way I've never been and never wanted to be. Ah, Andrea, he said, raising his glass toward me, que llegó a este país con $200 y hoy nos va a enseñar a todos cómo se construye de verdad. To Andrea, who arrived in this country with $200 and is going to teach all of us what real building looks like.
The whole table drank to that, and I remember feeling in that specific moment something close to what I imagine other people feel when they say they finally arrived somewhere. Not arrived in Spain. I'd arrived in Spain 18 years earlier with cement dust already permanently under my fingernails, but arrived in the specific room where men like Fernando Ibáñez decide who gets called socio and who gets called subcontratista for the rest of their working lives. I looked at Miguelín across the table, and he raised his glass back at me, quieter, no speech, just a small nod that meant more to me than Fernando's toast did, if I'm honest, because Miguelín's nods have never once needed correcting later. I think about that toast often now. Not with anger, not anymore. I've mostly burned through the anger. It took about a year. Doing exactly what I always tell young men in the comments under my videos to do with anger, which is to let it become fuel for something instead of letting it live in your chest, rotting everything around it. I think about it because it's proof, to me, that Fernando wasn't lying that night. He believed what he said. He respected what I'd built, genuinely, the same way I respected what he could do with a room full of city officials. Two respects, both real, sitting next to each other for 5 years, right up until the moment one man's debts made him decide that respect was a luxury he could no longer afford to keep paying for. That's the part of this story that still unsettles me more than the betrayal itself, if I'm being completely honest with you. It would almost be easier if Fernando had been performing our whole friendship from day one. Some patient long con, 5 years in the planning. He wasn't. He was a man who liked me, who respected me, who toasted me sincerely at a restaurant near Retiro, and who still, when the numbers in his own life got desperate enough, decided my 40% was a resource to be extracted rather than a woman to be protected. I've had to make my peace with the fact that those two versions of Fernando were never in conflict with each other in his own head. He held them both, easily, the way I once held liking him and never fully trusting him with an unlimited signature. The difference between us is that my caution never once required taking something that wasn't mine. 40% of a contract that size was still the single largest thing my company had ever touched.
4.1 million euros. A full renovation and partial reconstruction of a municipal market building in the Puente de Vallecas district, my own barrio, which mattered to me more than I told Fernando, more than I told almost anyone except my daughter Valentina, who understood immediately why I cared, because she's the one of my two children who inherited my stubbornness about where you come from mattering more than where you end up. Sebastian, my son, is the architect, 26 now, sharp, working for a firm in Chamberí that does the kind of glass and concrete residential towers that I privately think are ugly, and never say so, because he's good at what he does, and being good at something is worth more than my opinion about the aesthetics. Valentina is 23, a lawyer, still finishing her specialization, and she is the reason I understood, before Fernando ever tried anything, exactly how dangerous a poorly worded power of attorney can be. She used to correct my contracts at the dinner table when she was 19 years old, red pen in one hand, tortilla in the other, telling her vieja that a clause I'd signed without reading closely enough could be interpreted two ways, and one of those ways was not in my favor. I want you to hold on to that detail. It comes back. Elena Vasquez has been my lawyer since 2009, the same year I bought this table, which is not a coincidence, because that was the year I decided that a woman who is going to build something worth protecting needs someone whose whole job is protecting it.
Elena is a partner now at a commercial law firm near Salamanca, one of the expensive barrios. And every time I sit in her office, I am aware of the distance between where she works and where I work. And I have made peace with that distance because it means she's good at what she does. And I am not paying for the location. I am paying for the fact that in 16 years, she has never once let a contract of mine go out the door with a hole in it that a clever man could climb through. 16 years. There's that number again. I used to say it about the concrete. 16 años poniendo cemento en obras españolas. Sé lo que es una buena base. 16 years pouring cement on Spanish job sites. I know what a good foundation is. I started saying that in 2017 or so, when the number was actually true. And somewhere in the years since, it stopped being true, and I never bothered to change the sentence. Because a woman builds a phrase the same way she builds a foundation. You don't rip it up and re-pour it every time a new fact arrives. You let it settle. You let it mean something bigger than its own arithmetic. By the time this story happens, it had been closer to 24 years, but I still said 16, out of habit, out of superstition almost. The way old sailors keep saying things that stopped being literally true the day they stopped needing them to be. I'll say it again before this story is over.
Remember that when I do, it means something specific to me, even if the math doesn't add up anymore. Now, Miguel Torres, Miguelín, everyone calls him, has for so long that I think even his mother uses it. 44 years old, born in Vallecas, 2 streets from where I bought my building, which he has never let me forget, in the way that Madrileños never let you forget you weren't born in the same 3 streets they were. He's been my capataz, my main foreman, for 9 years. I hired him off another company's crew after I watched him spend 40 minutes arguing with an engineer twice his age about a beam calculation, and winning the argument, and then going back to laying block himself for the rest of the shift, because that's what needed doing, not because anyone was watching. That's the only kind of loyalty I trust, the kind that shows up when there's no audience. I am telling you all of this. The table, Fernando, Elena, Miguelín, my children, the 16 years that are really 24. Because a woman does not lose something the way I almost lost the market contract in Puente de Vallecas by accident. And she does not survive losing it by accident either. Everything I am about to tell you, every piece of it, was already sitting in the room before the betrayal happened. The betrayal didn't create anything new. It just showed me all at once what had been true the whole time, and I hadn't wanted to look at directly. There's one more habit of mine you need to understand before I go on, because it is the single fact that saves everything later. And if I don't plan it here, honestly, now, before you know why it matters, you won't believe me when I tell you how the story ends. It will feel like luck. It wasn't luck. I notarize everything. Not everything a normal businesswoman notarizes. Everything. Contracts, sure, that's standard.
But also side letters, also verbal agreements that other men would have shaken hands on and trusted. Also, and this is the part that made Elena laugh the first time I asked for it, before she stopped laughing and started respecting it, the exact boundaries of every power of attorney I have ever granted anyone in my life. Written narrow, specific, and filed with a notary before I ever hand a copy to the person it concerns. People ask me why. Sometimes they ask kindly, curious. Sometimes they ask like it's an insult, like I'm accusing them of something before they've done anything. I give everyone the same answer, and it's the truest thing I know about myself. I say, soy colombiana en España, y sé cuando hay que asegurarse. I'm Colombian in Spain, and I know when you need to protect yourself. I did not learn that lesson in Spain. I learned it before I ever got on the plane, in a country where a handshake and a signed paper were sometimes worth exactly the same amount, which is to say, worth exactly what the more powerful man in the room decided they were worth that day. I came to Europe with $200, and that lesson folded into the same part of me where the money was folded. I have never once regretted carrying it. Fernando Ibanez knew I did this. He'd seen me insist on it more than once, in front of clients, in front of his own people. He thought it was a quirk, a tick, something colorful about the Colombian contractor, a story he probably told at his own dinners. You know Morales, she notarizes her lunch order. The way people tell stories about someone's strangeness right up until the moment that strangeness is the only thing standing between them and losing everything.
He should have asked himself why a woman builds a habit like that, so deep into her bones that she never lets it go. Not once. Not even with the partner he liked. Not even after 5 good years. He didn't ask. That was his first mistake. It would not be his last. I should tell you about Carlos too, briefly, because you can't understand a woman's habits without understanding what broke her into having them. And Carlos was the first thing in Spain that ever broke me. We married in 2003, 2 years after I landed, both of us young, both of us convinced that love was the kind of foundation that didn't need a level or a plumb line, that it just held because you wanted it to. He was from Ecuador, Guayaquil, working in a hotel laundry when I met him, not long after I'd finally saved enough to bring Sebastian over from Cali. And for a decade, we built something together that I still, honestly, don't regret, whatever came after. Sebastian was born in 2000, before I ever left Cali, from an earlier relationship that ended badly and quietly and isn't part of the story. And he stayed with his grandmother those first 2 years while I got my footing in Madrid. That's who Rosario means, most of the time, when she talks about how much she raised that boy before I could. Carlos came into both our lives right around the time Sebastian arrived in Spain, stepped into being his father in every way that matters before Valentina was even born. And Valentina is his and mine together, born in 2003. And for a long time, a good long time, we were a family that worked the way families are supposed to work, imperfectly, loudly, but held together. It ended in 2018, the same year I bought the building. I've never decided if that's a coincidence or if some part of me poured all the love I had left into brick and mortar because the version of it that was supposed to go to a marriage had already drained out somewhere in the years before, in ways neither of us noticed happening until it had already happened. His lawyer, a decent man actually, just doing his job, served me with papers I hadn't seen coming at an office I'd built my whole life around trusting people in. And for about 4 months after that, I did not trust anyone, including myself, including my own judgment about who deserved trust and who didn't.
Elena was the one who pulled me out of that particular hole. Not as a therapist. She'd be the first to tell you she's not qualified for that and doesn't pretend to be. But as the person who sat across from me at this same oak table and said something I've never forgotten. She said, Andrea, no puedes controlar si alguien te va a traicionar. Eso ya lo aprendiste. Lo único que puedes controlar es cuánto puede costarte cuando pase. You can't control whether someone's going to betray you. You already learned that lesson. The only thing you can control is how much it costs you when it happens.
That's where the habit was actually born, if you want the honest origin of it. Not some noble immigrant wisdom I dress it up as when I'm telling this story to a camera. It was born out of a divorce that cost me more than money, in an office 2 floors below the one I'm sitting in right now telling you this. In the same year, I finally had enough success to afford the kind of table that could hold the weight of never letting it happen to me again. I raised Sebastian and Valentina mostly on shared custody after that, alternating weeks, learning to cook the specific things each of them liked, learning that Sebastian needed quiet to do his homework, and Valentina needed noise, the radio on, someone talking, or she couldn't focus at all. Carlos and I are civil now, have been for years. He remarried in 2021, a good woman, an accountant, someone steadier than I probably was for him in our last years together. And I mean that without bitterness, most days.
We see each other at the children's birthdays. We managed, eventually, the thing that a lot of divorced parents never manage, which is to let the children keep both of us without making them choose. But the habit stayed. The notarizing, the narrow language, the refusal to hand anyone unlimited trust in writing, even people I trusted completely in my heart. I did it with contractors. I did it with the bank when I bought the building. Ordóñez, the loan officer, used to joke that I made him initial more pages than the Bank of Spain's own regulators required. And he wasn't wrong. And I never apologized for it, because I'd learned by then that the apology usually comes from the person who got hurt for trusting too easily. And I had already paid that particular tuition once. I was not going to pay it twice. I did it with Fernando too, from the very beginning of the UTE, and he thought it was charming.
That's the word he used, actually. The first time he watched me insist Elena review even the routine subcontractor agreements, line by line, before I signed them. Charming. Encantador. Like I was a grandmother insisting on writing checks by hand in an age of instant transfers. A little old-fashioned, a little sweet. I think about that word a lot now. Charming. He watched the exact mechanism that would eventually stop him cold for 5 years and thought it was a personality quirk instead of what it actually was, which was a scar with a job to do. My mother died on a Tuesday. I was on the market site in Puente de Vallecas when Valentina called. Not my brother, not anyone in Cali, my daughter. Because somehow, in families like ours, the youngest ends up being the one who carries the worst news carefully, like she's afraid it'll spill. She'd gotten the call from my tia Rosario 20 minutes earlier.
Mama had been sick for 8 months by then. I want to be honest, this wasn't sudden the way these things sometimes are in the stories people tell for sympathy. It was cancer. Slow. And I had already flown to Cali twice that year to sit with her, and both times I flew back to Madrid telling myself the next call would give me more warning than this one did. The second to last time I saw her, 4 months before that Tuesday, she was still strong enough to sit up on the porch of the house on Calle 15 and drink coffee with me the way she had every morning of my childhood. And she asked me, out of nowhere, in the middle of a completely unrelated conversation about Valentina's studies, whether I was happy. Not whether the company was doing well, not whether I had enough money, enough contracts, enough of anything a mother worries a daughter in another country might be short of. Whether I was happy. I told her yes, mostly. And she looked at me the way she used to look at me when I was 9 years old and told her I was fine after my father left. And she said, Andrea, a mí no me puedes engañar. Te conozco desde antes de que supieras hablar. You can't fool me. I've known you since before you could talk. I didn't have a real answer for her. I still don't, if I'm honest with you now. I told her I was building something, and that building something and being happy were, for a woman like me, close enough to the same thing that I'd stop trying to tell them apart. She didn't argue with me. She just held my hand on that porch for a while, the two of us watching the street. And she said the kind of thing mothers say that sounds simple until you're 40 years old, turning it over at 4 in the morning with a coffin nearby. She said, El cemento seca, mija, pero la gente que uno quiera, a esa hay que regarla todos los días. Concrete dries, daughter. But the people you love, you have to water them every day. It didn't. It never does. Rosario said she went in the morning, quietly, in the bed in the house on Calle 15 where I grew up. The house I sent money to fix the roof on in 2011 and repaint in 2016. And never once in 25 years managed to sit inside for longer than 11 days at a stretch. I stood on a half-finished mezzanine floor of a market building with rebar sticking up out of the slab around my boots, and I told my daughter I'd call her back. And then I didn't move for a while. Miguelín found me there. He didn't ask what happened. He just stood next to me for a minute, the way you stand next to a wall that's just been told it's going to be torn down. And then he said, Vete, yo me quedo con esto. Go, I've got this. That's Miguelín in one sentence, if you ever need him summarized.
Here's what I need you to understand about what happened next, because it's the part of the story where I made a decision that I still, even now, do not entirely regret, even though it is the decision that let Fernando do what he did. I was not going to leave the UTE, the 14 employees, the 4.1 million euro contract with the municipal government that fines you by the day for delay, sitting with no one able to sign anything for however long I'd be gone. I didn't know yet if it would be 6 days or 3 weeks. You never know with a burial, with a family, with a mother. So 3 days before I flew out, I want to be exact about the timeline here because the timeline is the whole case later. 3 days before, I went to my notary. Not Fernando's notary, mine. A woman named Covadonga Reyes I've used for 11 years, in an office 2 streets from my own, who knows my signature better than my ex-husband ever did. I signed a poder, a power of attorney, granting Fernando Ibáñez the authority to act on my behalf, on behalf of Morales Construcciones, specifically and only for what the document called actos de gestión ordinaria del día a día en la obra del mercado de Puente de Vallecas, ordinary day-to-day management acts on the market job site, approving standard material deliveries, signing off on routine site paperwork the city required weekly, authorizing payment of subcontractor invoices already approved before I left. That was it. That was the whole list. And Covadonga and I went through every line of it together, because that's what I do. That's the 16 years. That's the 24 years. That's the $200 in my sock. You write down exactly what a man can do, and nothing else. And you notarize it before you hand it to him, so there is no argument later about what the paper meant.
I specifically did not, and this detail matters more than any other detail in this whole story, so hold on to it. I specifically did not grant Fernando any authority to modify, amend, sign, or in any way alter the Acuerdo de UTE itself, the governing agreement, the document that said 60-40, that said who owned what. Elena had drafted that clause with me 8 months earlier during a completely unrelated dispute with a subcontractor, more or less as a standing policy for any poder I ever granted on any project. Elena's rule, which I adopted as my own the day she said it to me. Nunca le des a nadie el poder de cambiar las reglas del juego mientras tú no estás mirando. Never give anyone the power to change the rules of the game while you're not watching.
I remember that appointment with Covadonga in more detail than I remember most of that terrible week, actually. Because grief hadn't fully landed on me yet. My mother was still alive when I signed that poder, still fighting, and some part of me was still pretending the call from Colombia might not come for months yet. Covadonga's office is small, 2 rooms above a pharmacy in Vallecas. Nothing like the marble lobby of Elena's firm near Salamanca. And she keeps a pot of coffee going all day that tastes burnt by 11 in the morning, and she drinks it anyway, out of habit, the way I say 16 years out of habit. She read the draft language out loud to me, twice, the way she always does, because she told me once, years ago, that most people who come to her office to sign a poder have never actually heard the words spoken aloud before, only seen them printed, and hearing a sentence is a different kind of understanding than reading it. Actos de gestión ordinaria del día a día, she said slowly, and then looked up at me over her glasses. Andrea, ¿esto cubre todo lo que necesitas cubrir? Porque una vez que te vayas, no vamos a poder ampliarlo sin que vuelvas a firmar en persona. Does this cover everything you need covered? Because once you leave, we won't be able to expand it without you coming back to sign in person. I told her it was fine as written. Narrow. I told her, and I remember saying this almost exactly because it's become something close to a prayer I say to myself before I sign anything of consequence, that I would rather Fernando call me on a bad international connection at 3 a.m. to ask permission for something urgent than come home to find he'd used a piece of paper I signed in a hurry to justify something I never intended.
Covadonga smiled at that, a small, tired, professional smile, and stamped the document and told me, the way she tells all her clients, Que Dios te acompañe, Andrea. God go with you. I didn't know yet how much that stamp and that narrowness and that small burnt pot of coffee upstairs from a pharmacy in Vallecas would end up being the entire reason I still had a company left to come home to. I flew out on a Thursday, Iberia direct to Bogota, then the connector down to Cali, 11 hours in the air, and then another hour on a smaller plane dropping through cloud into the valley, green mountains on both sides the way they always are, the way they were when I left in 2001 with $200 and a phone number, the way I hope they still are the day I finally stop coming back only for funerals. My brother Ivan picked me up at the airport. Ivan stayed. Never left Cali, never wanted to. Worked 30 years for the same bottling plant and retired with a pension and a house he'd never had to leave to earn it. There is history between my brother and me that this isn't the story to tell. Some of it is money, some of it is older than money, some of it is just two kids who watched their father leave when I was 9 and Ivan was 12, and came out the other side of that as two very different people. He hugged me at the airport the way we always hug, hard and brief and wordless. And then he drove me straight to the house on Calle 15, where half the barrio was already sitting on plastic chairs on the sidewalk outside, because that's how it's done there. The wake starts before the body is even properly settled, and grief becomes a thing the whole street holds together, instead of a thing one family carries alone in a quiet room, which is how it's done here in Spain. And I have never decided which way is kinder. I sat with my mother's body for 4 hours the first night. I'm not going to describe that to you in detail, because some things I've decided are mine and only mine, and that's one of them.
I'll tell you this much. She was 82. She had raised 2 kids mostly alone after our father left. She had cleaned other people's houses for 11 years to keep us in the same school, and she had never once, in 25 years, complained to me on the phone that I wasn't there enough. Even though I know now, Rosario told me at the wake, half to comfort me and half, I think, to make sure I carried it, that she used to tell her sisters she missed me every single day I'd been gone. 16 years pouring cement on Spanish job sites. I know what a good foundation is. I said that phrase out loud, quietly, sitting next to her coffin at 4 a.m. Not because it made any sense in that room, but because it's the sentence I say when I don't have another one. And grief, it turns out, is a job site too. You still need a foundation.
You still need to know where the water's going to go before it decides for you. And in that house, that week, the water was going everywhere. through my brother's old resentments, through my own guilt about every year I sent money instead of myself, through Valentina's voice cracking on the phone from Madrid because she couldn't get a flight in time for the burial and would have to say goodbye to her abuela over a video call held up by my cousin's shaking hand. Yvonne and I sat on that sidewalk together most of that first night. Plastic chairs, someone's radio playing salsa low enough to be respectful, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, after most of the neighbors had drifted home, he asked me the question I'd been dreading since I got off the plane. ¿Por qué te fuiste, hermana? Why did you leave? He'd asked me some version of that question 100 times over 25 years, always a little differently, always with a little less anger in it as the decades passed. But that night, with our mother's body still in the house behind us, it came out raw, like he'd been saving the rawest version of it for exactly this moment. I told him what I always told him, that there wasn't work in Cali in 2001 worth the name, that a woman with 2 toddlers, well, 1 toddler and 1 on the way with Carlos, couldn't build anything on what Colombia was offering a woman like me at that time. He said, quietly, not fighting, just tired, that he'd stayed and built a life too. A smaller one, sure, a pension and a paid-off house instead of 14 employees and a building with my name on it, but a life, and that he'd done it 2 streets from the woman who was now lying dead in the next room, and I hadn't. I didn't have a good answer for that. I still don't. I told him the only honest thing I had, which was that I didn't leave because Cali wasn't enough. I left because I was 25 years old and terrified that if I stayed, I'd spend my whole life wondering what I would have become somewhere else. And that fear turned out to be stronger than anything Cali could have offered me to stay. Yvonne nodded slowly, the way he does when he disagrees with you, but has decided the night isn't for arguing, and he put his arm around my shoulder, and we didn't say anything else for a long while. That's the closest my brother and I have come, in 25 years, to actually talking about it. I don't know if we'll ever get closer than that. Some foundations you pour once, imperfectly, and you learn to build on top of the crack, instead of tearing the whole slab out and starting again, because starting again, at our age, costs more than either of us has left to spend. The burial was Saturday. I stood in the cemetery on the hill above the city, the one you can see the whole valley from, green and gold in the morning light, the way Cali always looks like it's showing off a little, even when your heart is in pieces. And I put my hand on the coffin and told my mother, in the language she raised me in, that I was sorry, that I'd built something with the $200, that I hoped somewhere in whatever comes after, she could see the building in Vallecas with my name on the license plate outside it, and that I hoped that was enough, because it was all I had to offer a woman who gave me everything. Yvonne put his arm around me, first time in maybe a decade. I was supposed to fly back the following Thursday, 8 days in the end. Enough time to see my mother buried, to sit with my brother longer than I had in a decade, to let Rosario feed me until I couldn't stand it, to remember, briefly, painfully, what it felt like to be a daughter instead of a jefa. Enough time, it turned out, for Fernando Ibanez to decide that 8 days was exactly the window he'd been waiting for. The first sign was small enough that I almost let it go. It was the Monday before I flew back, 4 days into being in Cali, and Miguelín called me, not a message, a call, which from Miguelín already meant something, because he texts for everything. He calls for almost nothing. He thinks calling a grieving woman in another country is an imposition, and he's the kind of man who'd rather sit with a problem himself than hand it to someone with a coffin still fresh in his memory. But he called, And when I picked up, he was quiet for a second too long before he spoke. And I knew. Jefa, he said, no es nada urgente, pero Fernando estuvo aquí el sábado con dos tipos que no conozco. Trajeron una carpeta grande. Firmaron algo en la caseta. Fernando was here Saturday with two men I don't know. They brought a big folder. They signed something in the site office. I asked him what it was. He said he didn't know, that Fernando told him it was routine paperwork for the ayuntamiento, the city. Standard stuff. Nothing Miguelín needed to worry about. And Miguelín, who runs my sites like they're his own body, who once made an entire crew stop pouring a slab for 4 hours because he didn't trust the delivery ticket on a truckload of cement. Miguelín said okay anyway, because it wasn't his place to demand to see a legal document his boss's partner was signing. And because grief makes a woman's antenna point inward instead of outward. And mine were pointed at a coffin on a hill in Cali, not at a filing cabinet in Vallecas. But he mentioned it. That's Miguelín. He mentioned the thing that felt slightly wrong even when he couldn't tell you exactly why, because 9 years of working for me had taught him that I would rather hear 10 false alarms than miss one real one. I called Fernando that same night. He picked up on the second ring, warm, easy, told me, and I remember this almost word for word because I've replayed it so many times since. He told me, Andrea, hermana, no te preocupes por nada aquí. Está todo controlado. Descansa, entierra a tu madre y hablamos con calma cuando vuelvas. Don't worry about anything here. It's all under control. Rest, bury your mother, and we'll talk calmly when you're back. I want to tell you I felt something in my stomach when he said that. I want to tell you some instinct fired, some alarm, because that would make me look sharper than I actually was in that moment. The truth is, I felt relief. I felt grateful to have a partner who would tell me to grieve instead of work. I thanked him. I told Miguelín the next day it was probably nothing, some paperwork for the market inspection schedule, and I went back to sitting with my brother on the sidewalk outside my mother's house, drinking coffee that Rosario refused to let go cold, telling stories about a woman who was 3 days in the ground and would be, I understood even then, in every story I told for the rest of my life. I flew back the following Thursday. Bogotá, then Madrid, the long leg overnight, the kind of flight where you land feeling like a version of yourself that's been badly translated. Valentina picked me up at Barajas. She'd wanted to, insisted, said her vieja shouldn't come home from burying her mother to an empty apartment or a taxi driver who doesn't know the way she likes to sit in silence for the first 20 minutes of any drive.
She hugged me at arrivals longer than either of us usually allows ourselves, and in the car, she told me Sebastian wanted to come by that weekend, that she'd already told the office she needed the morning off to be with me. And I remember thinking, driving through the gray outskirts of Madrid after 8 days of Cali's green mountains, that at least I still had this. 2 children who showed up. A daughter who knew when to be quiet in a car. I didn't go to the office that day. I told myself I'd go Friday, rested, clear-headed, ready to hear whatever Fernando needed to tell me calmly. That was the plan. Friday morning, I walked into Morales Construcciones a little after 8, before most of the office staff arrived, the way I like it. Just me and the building and the quiet. And I climbed the stairs to my office on the 2nd floor, and I put my bag down, and I saw the folder on the oak table. Not my folder. Not anything I'd left there.
A blue legal folder, tied with the little cotton ribbon Spanish notaries still use, sitting square in the center of the table, like someone had placed it there deliberately, wanting it to be the first thing I saw. Before I tell you what was inside, hit subscribe if you haven't already. This channel puts out a new true story every week, and what I found on that oak table that Friday morning is the reason I never again signed anything without understanding exactly what it could cost me. Inside was a copy of a modificación del acuerdo de UTE, a modification to the joint venture agreement, dated the Saturday Miguelín had called me about. The Saturday Fernando brought two men I didn't know into my site office. Notarized, registered, filed with the Registro Mercantil, the commercial registry, 4 days before I'd even landed back in Spain. I read it twice, standing up, because some part of me refused to sit down for it, as if staying on my feet meant I still had control of something in that room.
The new agreement gave Ibáñez y Morales, the UTE, the same name, same tax ID, same public face. But the internal split had changed. 60-40 had become 80-20. My favor gone from 40% to 20. And buried in Article 6, in the dry procedural language these documents love to hide their knives in, was a clause stripping me of independent signing authority on any disbursement over 15,000 euros. Every payment above that line, going forward, would require Fernando's countersignature. Mine alone would no longer move money. And the justification? Right there on the second page, citing legal basis for why this could happen without my physical presence, without my signature on this specific document? The poder. My own power of attorney. The one I'd signed with Covadonga 3 days before I flew to Cali. The one that said, in language I had read line by line at my own notary's desk, Actos de gestión ordinaria del día a día.
Fernando's lawyers, and he clearly had lawyers now, good ones, the kind you don't hire for a Tuesday afternoon, had built an argument that the modification fell inside ordinary day-to-day management because it was, in their framing, an administrative restructuring necessary to keep the UTE operating smoothly during a partner's extended absence, not a change of ownership in substance, merely in operational governance. It was a lie built entirely out of the shape of the truth. That's the worst kind. A lie built out of nothing would have insulted me less. I sat down then, finally. I put both hands flat on the oak table, the way I used to when Casals, the accountant, brought me bad news years ago. The way I do when I need the table to hold something so I don't have to hold it entirely with my own arms. And I looked at that clause for a long time. 20%. 20. Of a company I'd carried on my back out of a sock with $200 in it.
20%. Decided in a site office by two men I'd never met, while I sat beside my mother's coffin, 4,000 kilometers away, not thinking, not once, that the danger to my life's work was standing closer to home than the grief was. Sebastian found me there. He'd stop by before work, the way he does maybe twice a month, mostly to raid the small kitchen in the back for coffee before heading to his own office in Chambéry. And he walked into my office and found his mother sitting motionless at a table, with both hands flat against the wood, staring at a document like it might change if he looked at it long enough. He didn't say much at first. He's like me that way. Or maybe I'm like him. I've never decided which direction that inheritance runs. He picked up the modification document, read the first page, and I watched his face do something I don't see often on my son. who has spent his whole adult life being calm about things other people panic over. I watched him get angry, quietly, the kind of anger that doesn't raise a voice, but changes the shape of a jaw. Mamá, he said, esto es de cuando estabas en Cali, con la abuela. This is from when you were in Cali, with Grandma. I told him yes. He put the document down very carefully, like it was something that might cut him if he held it wrong. And he said, Voy a llamar a mi jefe y le digo que hoy no entro. I'm going to call my boss and tell him I'm not coming in today.
I told him no, that he should go to work, that there was nothing he could do in that office that Elena couldn't do better, and that the kindest thing he could do for me that morning was to go be 26 years old with a normal Friday in front of him, because I needed to know, somewhere in the middle of all this, that at least one part of my life was still moving forward the way it was supposed to. He didn't like that answer. He argued with me for a few minutes, which he almost never does, and eventually he left, but not before he stood in the doorway and said something that I've thought about since. Something that told me my son understood exactly what kind of fight this was going to be, even before I'd said a single word about strategy. Vas a necesitar algo más que estar enojada, mamá. Vas a necesitar tener razón en papel. You're going to need more than being angry. You're going to need to be right on paper. He's an architect, my son.
He thinks in load paths and structural tolerances, in the difference between a building that looks strong and a building that is strong. I don't think he was talking only about the law when he said that. I think he was talking about the entire architecture of a woman's life. That anger, however justified, doesn't hold weight on its own. You need documentation under it. You need a foundation poured before the storm arrives, not during it. I did not call Fernando first. I want you to understand that because it tells you who I actually am underneath the tiredness, underneath the 25 years. My first instinct was not rage directed outward. My first instinct was to protect what was still mine to protect before I said a single word to the man who tried to take it. I called Elena Vasquez.
She picked up on the first ring. Elena always does. It's one of the small reasons I've stayed with her 16 years, 24 years, however long it's actually been. And I said 4 words to her, the only 4 words I had the composure for at that moment. Fernando me robó todo. Fernando robbed me of everything. There was a pause. Then, in the voice she uses when a client is about to need her to be calmer than he is, she said, Cuéntame exactamente qué pasó, Andrea. Despacio, desde el principio. Tell me exactly what happened, slowly, from the beginning. I told her, all of it. The poder, the language Covadonga and I had written together, the folder on my table, the 20%, the 15,000 euro signature clause, the date, the 2 men Miguelín didn't recognize. When I finished, Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that I have thought about almost every day since, because it was the first time in 9 terrible days that anyone had told me something that felt like solid ground under my feet, instead of one more thing giving way. Andrea, she said, ¿tú le diste poder para modificar el acuerdo de UTE? Did you give him power to modify the UTE agreement? No, I said, nunca. Eso lo dejamos afuera a propósito. Fue idea tuya, de hecho. No, never. We left that out on purpose. It was your idea, actually. And I heard her exhale, slowly. The sound of a lawyer realizing the fight in front of her is winnable. And she said, Entonces, si lo que me estás diciendo es verdad, y te conozco, sé que lo es. Lo que firmó Fernando el sábado no vale nada. Es papel. Es papel caro y bien escrito, pero es papel. If what you're telling me is true, and I know you, I know it is, then what Fernando signed on Saturday isn't worth anything. It's paper. Expensive, well-written paper.
But paper. I put my head down on the oak table for a second. Just a second. 25 years I don't remember doing that before. Not once. Not even the week Carlos's lawyer served me papers I hadn't seen coming either. Then I lifted my head, because that's not who I am for very long. And I asked Elena the only question that mattered.
¿Cómo lo tumbamos? How do we tear it down? Elena laid it out for me over coffee that same afternoon, in her office near Salamanca, the expensive barrio, with a view of a street I couldn't have afforded to park on when I first met her. She had already, in the 3 hours since my call, pulled the filed modification from the Registro Mercantil and cross-referenced it against the original UTE agreement and against the exact text of my poder. And she had done what good lawyers do, which is take a situation that feels to the person living it like chaos, like the sky falling, and turn it into a list. Primero, she said. First. El poder es claro. Gestión ordinaria. No dice nada de modificar el acuerdo societario. Cualquier notario razonable, cualquier juez, va a leer esa cláusula igual que la leemos nosotros. The power of attorney is clear. Ordinary management. It says nothing about modifying the corporate agreement.
Any reasonable notary, any judge is going to read that clause the way we read it. Segundo. Second. Vamos a presentar una impugnación formal en el registro, alegando extralimitación de poder. Eso congela la eficacia de la modificación mientras se resuelve. We're filing a formal challenge at the registry, alleging that he exceeded the scope of his authority. That freezes the modification's legal effect while it's being resolved. Tercero. Third, and this was the part where her voice changed, got quieter, more careful, because she knows me well enough after all these years to know how I take news that involves waiting. Esto no se resuelve en un día, Andrea. Puede tardar semanas. Y mientras tanto, la incertidumbre legal sobre quién firma qué en esa UTE puede parar pagos, parar certificaciones de obra, y el ayuntamiento no tiene paciencia infinita con proyectos que huelen a conflicto societario. This doesn't resolve in a day. It could take weeks, and in the meantime, the legal uncertainty over who signs what in that UTE can stop payments, stop the work certifications the project depends on, and the city council doesn't have infinite patience for projects that smell like an internal ownership conflict. That was the part that kept me up that night. Not the 20%. The 20% made me angrier than I've been in a decade. But anger I know how to carry. Anger is just weight. And I've carried weight my whole life. What kept me up was the 14 families whose Friday paychecks came out of that market contract's cash flow. What also kept me up was a delay penalty clause in the municipal contract that fined the UTE €800 a day past deadline, a number that had never worried me before because I'd never given Fernando a reason to introduce chaos into a project I ran like a Swiss clock. There was a night, 4 or 5 days into the fight, when I let myself consider the possibility that we could lose.
Elena never told me we couldn't. She's too careful a lawyer to promise a client certainty, and I've always respected her more for that carefulness than I would have if she'd simply told me what I wanted to hear. What she told me, sitting across from me at this table with a glass of wine neither of us finished, was that the Poder's language was strong, that Covadonga's account would be credible, and that the pattern of Elizondo's prior sanctions, which we hadn't even found yet at that point, that came later through Valentina, gave us a real chance. But she also told me that Spanish commercial litigation had surprised smarter lawyers than her before, and that I needed to be prepared, emotionally, for a process that might take longer and cost more than either of us wanted, even if we ultimately won.
I asked her directly, what happened if we lost? If some judge or registrar, for reasons neither of us could predict, decided the modification stood. She was honest with me, the way she's always been honest with me in 16 years, 24 years, however long it's actually been. She said I'd be left holding 20% of a UTE controlled by a man who'd already shown me exactly what he was capable of doing the moment my back was turned. And that realistically, in that scenario, the only sane path forward would be to sell my remaining stake for whatever I could get and walk away from 4.1 million euros of work my own hands had built to protect myself from a partner I could no longer trust with anything. I sat with that possibility for the rest of that night, alone, at the oak table, running my hand along the grain of the wood, the way I do when I need to think and don't want to think out loud. I decided something in the dark that night that I never said to Elena, never said to Miguelin, never said to my children, because it wasn't a decision that needed an audience. I decided that even if we lost the legal fight, I was not going to let Fernando keep any part of that contract without a fight that cost him everything he had left to lose, too. I didn't know yet what that would look like. I just knew I wasn't going to be a woman who rolled over because the paperwork got complicated. I've never been that woman, not once, not in 25 years, and I wasn't going to start at 51, with my mother 11 days in the ground. I went to the site the next morning before I went anywhere else. I needed to stand on concrete before I did anything about paper.
Miguelin was already there, obviously, 6 in the morning, checking rebar spacing on the section we were pouring that week. And when he saw my face, he set down his clipboard and just waited, the way he does, for me to decide how much I wanted to say. I told him everything, all of it, standing on the mezzanine where I'd gotten the news about my mother days earlier, which felt, honestly, like a cruel kind of symmetry, the same slab of half-finished concrete hosting the worst week of my professional life directly on top of the worst week of my personal one. Miguelin didn't say much. He's not a man of much, but he said one thing that mattered more to me than anything Elena told me, because it wasn't strategy, it was loyalty, plain and unshaped by law degrees. Jefa, lo que necesite, Los 14 estamos con usted. Whatever you need, boss. All 14 of us are with you. I confronted Fernando 2 days later.
Elena wanted to do it entirely through lawyers, wanted me nowhere near a room with him until the registry challenge was formally filed and airtight. And mostly, I listened to her, because in 25 years, I've learned the difference between the advice you take because it's comfortable and the advice you take because the person giving it is smarter than you about the specific thing at hand. But I told her I needed one conversation, face to face, before the lawyers took over completely, because Fernando Ibáñez was going to hear from me directly that I knew exactly what he'd done, and I was not going to let a filing do that talking for me. We met at a cafe near the Retiro, his choice, neutral ground, which I understood, even as I agreed to it, was itself a kind of tactic, a public place where he assumed I'd keep my voice level, my hands on the table, my Colombian temper, as he'd probably describe it in his head, in check.
He tried warmth first, stood up when I arrived, hand extended. Andrea, hermana, siento mucho lo de tu madre, de verdad. I'm truly sorry about your mother. And something in me that had been holding steady since the blue folder on my table finally cracked. Not into shouting. I don't shout. My father shouted, and I decided at 9 years old I would never be a woman whose children flinched at the sound of her. It cracked into something colder. I didn't shake his hand. I sat down. I put my own folder on the table between us, copies, everything Elena had prepared, and I said, No uses a mi madre para suavizar esto. Don't use my mother to soften this. He tried the administrative language next, the same language from the modification itself, operational governance, necessary continuity, told me he'd been trying to protect the project while I was... And he actually used this phrase, and I will remember it for the rest of my life. Mientras estabas fuera de circulación.
While you were out of circulation. Out of circulation. My mother in the ground 4 days, and I was out of circulation. I told him, very quietly, that the poder he'd used to justify the modification specified ordinary day-to-day management, and that reassigning 40% of my equity and stripping my signature authority above 15,000 euros was not, by any reasonable reading, day-to-day anything. I told him the registry challenge was already filed. I told him Covadonga Reyes, my notary, would testify to exactly what that poder was drafted to permit and what it wasn't, because she'd drafted it with me, line by line, 3 days before I flew to bury my mother, precisely because I have never in 25 years handed anyone in this country a piece of unlimited trust. Not a bank, not a client, not a friend, and I told him this last part directly, watching his face while I said it. Not a socio I liked.
He tried one more thing before the warmth cracked completely, and it's the thing I've turned over most in the months since, because it was the closest he came to being honest with me. He leaned forward, dropped his voice like we were still friends sharing a confidence, and said, Andrea, seamos prácticos. Podemos arreglar esto entre nosotros, sin abogados, sin registro. Te devuelvo un 5% más de lo que tenías, y seguimos siendo socios, y nadie tiene que enterarse de nada. Let's be practical. We can fix this between us. No lawyers, no registry. I'll give you back 5% more than you had, and we stay partners, and nobody has to find out anything. 45%, in other words. He was offering to keep 5% of what he'd stolen, permanently, as the price of making the whole embarrassing episode disappear quietly. No registry finding, no formal record of what he'd actually done. Nothing that would follow him to the next partner he tried this with. I asked him if he understood what he was actually proposing. He said he was proposing a reasonable business resolution between two adults. I told him he was proposing that I pay him a 5% finder's fee for the privilege of not being robbed the full amount, and that the fact he thought I might take that deal told me more about how he saw me than anything in the modification document itself. Fernando, I said, ¿tú crees que porque empecé con $200, cualquier cosa por encima de cero me tiene que parecer una ganancia? Te equivocaste conmigo desde el principio. You think that because I started with $200, anything above zero should feel like a win to me? You misjudged me from the very beginning. That's when Fernando's warmth ran out, and I finally saw the man underneath it, which is, I think, the moment this story actually turns, more than the folder on the table, more than the phone call from Miguelín. Because up until that cafe, some small part of me was still hoping there'd be an explanation, a misunderstanding, something that let me keep believing the version of Fernando I'd known for 5 years. There wasn't. He leaned back, dropped the hermana, and told me, flatly, the dry madrileño humor gone, nothing behind his eyes now but arithmetic, that his own company was carrying debt from 2 other projects that had gone badly, that he needed the market contract's cash flow restructured in his favor to keep his creditors calm, and that he'd assumed, reasonably in his mind, that a woman from Cali with a company built out of nothing would understand better than anyone that survival sometimes requires taking what you need while the other woman's back is turned. I sat with that for a second. Not the threat of it, the insult of it. He'd taken my own history, the $200, the 16 years, the 24 years, and tried to use it as an excuse for robbing me. As if the fact that I know what it costs to build something from nothing should make me more understanding of a man tearing down what I'd built, instead of less. 16 años poniendo cemento en obras españolas, I told him, standing up, leaving the folder on the table for him to keep, because I didn't need it anymore. Elena had originals. Sé lo que es una buena base. ¿Y tú, Fernando? Nunca tuviste una. 16 years pouring cement on Spanish job sites. I know what a good foundation is. And you, Fernando, never had one. I walked out. I didn't look back to see his face.
I've thought about that since, whether I should have looked, whether there was something in his expression in that last second that would have told me more about what came next than anything the lawyers eventually found. I'll never know. I didn't look. The registry doesn't move because you're right. I learned that the hard way, over the 11 days that followed. 11 days that taught me more about the difference between justice and paperwork than any of the 25 years before them. Elena filed the impugnación, the formal challenge, on a Tuesday. Under Spanish administrative procedure, a properly filed challenge alleging extralimitación de poder, exceeding the scope of authority, should in theory suspend the practical effect of a disputed registration while it's reviewed. In theory. In practice, the Registro Mercantil of Madrid is a building full of overworked functionaries managing a backlog that predates most of the marriages in this country. And the clerk assigned to our file, a tired man named Padilla, who I came to both resent and eventually quietly respect, told and then on the phone, not unkindly, that suspensión and movimiento inmediato are two different animals in his world, and that the modification would remain formally on record, visible to anyone who pulled the UTE's public file, until a resolution was issued. That mattered more than it sounds like it should, because 3 days after the impugnación was filed, someone at the ayuntamiento, the city, noticed.
Public contracts of that size get periodically reviewed, and a review clerk named Ordaz, doing nothing more sinister than his job, flagged that the registered ownership structure of Ibáñez y Morales UTE showed an unresolved legal dispute, and the market renovation project received a formal notice. Certifications of completed work and the payments tied to them would be placed on administrative hold pending clarification of ¿Quién tiene la representación legal válida de la unión temporal? Who holds valid legal representation of the joint venture?
I want to tell you about the waiting room, because if you've never fought a bureaucracy for something that matters to you, you don't know what it does to a woman to sit in a plastic chair for 3 hours under fluorescent light, watching a number counter click forward 1 digit every 12 minutes, holding a folder of documents that you know in your bones prove you're right, while knowing that being right and being seen are two entirely different processes run by entirely different clocks. I sat next to a woman that day, waiting for a completely unrelated matter, a widow trying to sort out an inheritance registration for a small apartment her husband had left her. And we talked for a while, the way strangers do in rooms like that, united by nothing except the shared experience of waiting on a system that owes you nothing back for your patience. She'd been coming to that same office for 5 months. 5 months for an apartment worth less than 1 month of what Fernando had tried to take from me. I remember thinking, sitting there, that whatever I was going through it fast, relatively, because I had Elena, because I had money for good lawyers, because I had a business with 14 employees whose collective stake in this outcome pushed the case quietly up whatever informal priority list exists in a place like that. That widow didn't have any of that. She just had patience and grief and a number that clicked forward 1 digit every 12 minutes. When I finally got in to see Ordaz, he was younger than I expected, maybe 35, tired in the specific way of a civil servant managing more files than any one person should reasonably manage. And he was not unkind to me, which I want to be fair about, because it would be easy to make him the villain of this section of the story, and he wasn't.
He explained patiently that his office had no authority to make a legal determination about who held valid signing authority in a disputed private commercial agreement. That wasn't his job. That was the registry's job. And until the registry ruled, his only responsible option was to keep the payment hold in place, because releasing municipal funds against a certification signed by a party whose authority was formally in dispute would expose the city itself to liability if the dispute resolved against that party. I understood the logic. I hated the logic. Both of those things were true at the same time, which is most of what I learned about institutions during those 11 days. That the people inside them are very often reasonable, and the system built around them is very often slow, And those two facts don't cancel each other out. They just sit next to each other, making everyone involved miserable in a perfectly polite, perfectly documented way. 14 employees. A contract with an €800 a day penalty clause for delay, now sitting frozen not because of any delay I'd cause, but because Fernando's forgery, I'm calling it what it was, even though the legal language stayed more careful than that for weeks, had made the entire project radioactive to a city government that has zero appetite for funding anything that might end up in a courtroom. This is the part of the story I most want the men and women watching this who run their own small businesses to understand, because it's the part nobody warns you about when you dream of building something. It is not enough to be right. I was right. Elena was certain of it. Covadonga was certain of it, even, I think. In some buried part of himself, Fernando was certain of it. Being right got me a place in a queue. The system does not care who's right nearly as much as it cares about whose paperwork is cleanest and whose patience runs out last.
I spent those 11 days doing 2 jobs at once, the way I've done most of my life. Mornings on the site with Miguelin, because concrete doesn't care about legal disputes, and the market building still needed to go up correctly, whether or not anyone was getting paid for it that week. I made the call, and it cost me sleep, and it cost the company real money out of reserves I'd built for exactly this kind of emergency. To keep paying my 14 people out of pocket while the certifications sat frozen. Because I was not going to be the reason Miguelin's crew missed a Friday paycheck over a fight that was mine, not theirs. Afternoons in Elena's office, or on calls with Padilla's supervisor, or once, memorably, in a waiting room at the Ayuntamiento for 3 hours to speak to Ordaz directly. A conversation that taught me the particular Spanish art of being told no in 11 extremely polite sentences. There was one Friday in the middle of those 11 days I still think about more than the others. A young worker named Bilal, 24 years old, Moroccan, been with me 2 years, came to find me on the site during the lunch break, embarrassed, the way men are when they have to ask for something they feel they shouldn't have to ask for. His wife had just had their second child, and rent was due Monday, and he'd heard, the way everyone on a job site eventually hears everything, faster than any official announcement could travel, that the certifications were frozen, that there was some kind of trouble with the ownership of the company. He didn't ask me if he was going to get paid. That's the part that stayed with me. He asked me if there was anything he could do to help. Extra hours, a Saturday shift, anything, because he'd rather work for the money than worry about whether it was coming.
I told him his pay was never in question, that whatever happened with lawyers and registries and men in Madrid who thought paperwork was a kind of magic trick, no one on my payroll was going to feel it in their pocket. Not while I had €1 left in reserve to prevent it. I meant it when I said it, and I kept meaning it every one of those 11 days, even as I watched the number in my company's reserve account get smaller than I'd ever let it get in 16 years of running a business. 24 years, I mean, but you understand by now why I keep saying it wrong. Bilal thanked me in a way that embarrassed both of us a little, and went back to work. And I stood there for a minute afterward, thinking about the $200 in my sock in 2001, about how there had been no Andrea Morales standing on a site telling 25-year-old me that my pay was never in question, and how the entire reason I'd built this company the way I built it, slow, careful, over-documented, almost paranoid about protecting what was mine, was so that 14 men like Dalal would never have to learn the lesson I learned the hard way, alone, in a country that owed me nothing when I arrived in it. That's the part of this story that has nothing to do with Fernando Ibáñez, and it's the part I think about the most. On the 8th day, a man I hadn't heard from in 3 years called me. Rodrigo Mena, who I'd known socially through the same Chamber of Commerce circuit where I'd first met Fernando, a supplier of materials. Pleasant enough, the kind of man who exists in every industry as a connector, someone who knows everyone and owes everyone small favors and collects them slowly over decades. He asked to meet for coffee, said it casually, said he'd heard I was going through something complicated with Fernando and wanted to see if he could help as a neutral party, un amigo de los dos, a friend to both of us. I went, mostly out of curiosity, and within 10 minutes I understood exactly what the meeting actually was. Rodrigo talked, gently, reasonably, about how disputes like this could damage both their reputations in a business community that is smaller than people think, how word travels fast among the handful of firms that bid on municipal contracts in Madrid, how a public legal fight, even one I won, might make future partners wary of working with me, wary of a contractor who takes disagreements to the registry instead of resolving them like professionals. He never once mentioned Fernando had sent him. He didn't have to. I've been in enough rooms in 25 years to recognize a message being delivered by a man who thinks he's too smooth to be recognized as a messenger. I let him finish. Then I asked him directly whether Fernando had asked him to speak to me, and he hesitated just long enough to answer the question without saying a word, and I told him something I hadn't fully worked out until the sentence was already leaving my mouth. Rodrigo, tú y yo nos conocemos hace años, y te voy a decir esto con respeto. La reputación que me preocupa no es la que se arma en un almuerzo de Cámara de Comercio. Es la que tienen mis 14 empleados de mí, cuando les pregunten si su jefa se dejó robar por miedo a lo que dijeran de ella. Esa es la única reputación que no puedo permitirme perder. You and I have known each other for years, and I'll say this with respect. The reputation that worries me isn't the one built at a Chamber of Commerce lunch. It's the one my 14 employees have of me when someone asks them whether their boss let herself get robbed because she was afraid of what people might say about her. That's the only reputation I can't afford to lose.
Rodrigo didn't have much to say to that. He finished his coffee, told me he understood, wished me luck in a way that sounded like he already knew luck wasn't going to be the deciding factor, and left. I never heard from him again either, and I've noticed in the year since that my name doesn't come up on his supplier list the way it used to. That's fine. I've built a company for 25 years on men like Miguelín and Bilal, not men like Rodrigo Mena. And I sleep considerably better because of which category I chose to spend my loyalty on. It was Valentina in the end who found the thread that unraveled it faster than any of us expected. She came by the office on a Thursday evening. She still does that, still shows up with food sometimes. 23 years old and already more disciplined about checking in on her mother than I ever was on mine. God rest her wherever she is. And she found me at the oak table with the entire case file spread across it. Every filing, every date, every notarized page, because by then I couldn't sleep without reading through it one more time, looking for the thing I'd missed. She read it the way she used to read my contracts at 19, red pen practically materializing out of nowhere. And about 40 minutes in, she stopped on the modification document itself, on the notarization block at the bottom, the part with the notary's registration number and the date, and the specific legal basis cited for why the document could be executed without my physical presence. Mamá, she said, este notario, el que hizo esto con Fernando, ¿lo conoces? I didn't.
A notary named Elizondo, someone from Fernando's side, not anyone I'd worked with. Valentina pulled up something on her phone, a database she has access to through her firm. Part of her training rotation had been in exactly this kind of corporate diligence work. And she found that this same notary, Elizondo, had 3 prior administrative sanctions on record for irregularities in exactly this category: executing modifications to corporate governing documents on the basis of powers of attorney that a subsequent review found had been read more broadly than their language supported. 3 times. This wasn't Elizondo's first time helping a man do to his partner what Fernando had tried to do to me. Elena took that information the next morning and did something I will be grateful to her for as long as I run this company. She didn't just add it to our filing as one more argument. She used it to request an expedited review on the specific grounds of pattern misconduct by the executing notary, a category the registry actually does move faster on because a notary with sanctions history is a liability to the whole system, not just to one dispute between one contractor and one engineer in Madrid. Covadonga Reyes gave her sworn declaration the same week, a formal, notarized statement of her own, describing exactly how she and I had drafted the poder, what actos de gestión ordinaria was intended to mean, what it was explicitly not intended to cover, and the fact that I had specifically asked her, unprompted, to exclude any authority touching the UTE's governing structure because, and this is in her declaration, word for word, and I still have a copy of it in the drawer of the oak table, under the surface where I keep the handful of documents that actually matter. La señora Morales me indicó que, en su experiencia, la confianza y la autoridad legal son 2 cosas distintas, y que ella prefiere no confundirlas nunca en un documento. Ms. Morales told me that in her experience, trust and legal authority are 2 different things, and that she prefers never to confuse them in a document.
25 years distilled into one sentence, read back to me by my own notary in a legal declaration that ended up being the single most important piece of paper in the entire case. Elena called me herself, not her assistant, on the 19th day, a Tuesday. I noticed that later, that it was a Tuesday, the same day of the week my mother died. And I don't put much stock in that kind of symmetry usually, but I noticed it. And I could tell from the first word she said, just my name, just Andrea, the particular weight she put on the 3 syllables, that it was over before she said anything else. Ganamos. We won. I was standing at the oak table when she said it, of course. Where else would I have been? I put my free hand flat on the wood, the way I do, the way I'd done the morning I found the folder. Except this time, the gesture meant something entirely different. Not bracing against a blow, but grounding myself against something almost too large to feel standing up. She read me the resolution over the phone, the formal language, void ab initio, void from the beginning, as if the whole ugly modification had simply never existed in the eyes of the law. My original 40% restored, my signing authority restored, and beneath it, almost as an afterthought in her voice, even though it wasn't an afterthought at all, the note about Elizondo. 4 documented complaints in 6 years. The professional body's threshold for looking the other way finally exhausted. his career very likely over. Not because of what he'd done to me specifically, but because I'd been the fourth woman unlucky enough, or lucky enough, depending how you look at it, to be the complaint that broke the pattern open. I called Miguelín next, standing in the same spot, and I heard him relay it to the crew before he'd even finished the sentence to me. Heard the site go up in noise behind him. Men who'd spent 11 days quietly worried about a company they'd given years of their lives to, celebrating in the particular way construction crews celebrate, which is loud, physical, somebody inevitably getting picked up and nearly dropped. I told Miguelín to take everyone for beers that Friday, on the company, and he laughed and said, "Jefa, ya lo tenía reservado desde ayer. Tenía fe." Boss, I already booked it yesterday. I had faith.
I didn't call Fernando. There was nothing left to say to him that the registry hadn't already said better, in language colder and more permanent than anything I could have managed across a cafe table. The city lifted the payment hold 8 days after that, once Ordaz's office confirmed clean legal representation of the UTE. We'd lost, by my accountant's final count, almost 60,000 euros in delayed cash flow, absorbed penalties, and legal fees. 14 people never missed a paycheck. That's the number I actually care about when I do the accounting of that month in my head at night. 14 for 14. Fernando Ibáñez did not go to prison. I want to be honest about that too, because this isn't a story where a villain gets marched away in handcuffs while triumphant music plays, and I've grown to distrust any version of this story, mine or anyone else's, that pretends real life resolves that cleanly.
Elena and I discussed a criminal complaint. Falsedad documental, document fraud, was a real possibility. She thought a strong one, given Elizondo's history. And I sat with that decision for 4 days at the oak table, alone most nights, turning it over. In the end, I chose not to file it. Not because I forgave him. I want to be clear about that, because forgiveness is a word people throw around in these stories like it's the finish line, and it isn't. Not for me. I didn't forgive Fernando Ibáñez. What I did was arithmetic, the same arithmetic that's carried me through every hard decision since I stepped off a plane with $200 folded into my sock. A criminal complaint meant months, maybe years of depositions, court dates, a prosecutor's calendar that moves even slower than the registro mercantil, my name and my company's name attached publicly to a fraud case, regardless of who was the victim in it. Because that's how headlines work. Empresaria colombiana en disputa legal reads the same whether you're the thief or the woman who got robbed, to a client scanning it in 10 seconds before deciding who to award next year's contract to. I had a market building to finish. I had 14 families depending on Friday. I had, if I'm honest, exactly enough fight left in me for one battle, and I'd already spent it winning back what was mine. I didn't have another battle in me for punishing the man who took it, not on top of that. So instead, Elena negotiated an exit.
Fernando's company sold its remaining stake in the UTE back to Morales Construcciones at a valuation his own lawyers didn't have the leverage to argue down, given what the registry's resolution had just established about the character of his conduct. I finished the market renovation alone, 6 weeks behind the original schedule, absorbing costs I'll be feeling in this year's numbers, but finished it, and finished it correctly, the way I finish everything. And the city inspector who signed off on the final certification, a decent man, unrelated to any of this, just doing his job, told me on his way out that it was some of the cleanest structural work he'd reviewed in that district in a decade. I told him, 16 años poniendo cemento en obras españolas. Sé lo que es una buena base. He laughed, the way people do when they think it's a nice thing an old contractor says to sound wise. He didn't know it was 16 going on 24. He didn't know it was the same sentence I'd said to Fernando across a cafe table. The last thing I ever said directly to that man's face. He just heard a proud old immigrant with good concrete in her blood. And honestly, that's fine. Not every sentence needs to be understood by everyone who hears it. Some of them are mine.
Miguelín got a raise that I should have given him 2 years earlier, and finally had the excuse and the spine to push through with the accountant without apologizing for it. Valentina finished her specialization 3 months later with a thesis advisor who, when she told him, carefully, generally, without names, about a case involving a modified corporate governance agreement executed on an overbroad power of attorney, told her it was the cleanest real-world example of the principle he'd seen in years, and asked if he could use an anonymized version in his lecture notes. She said yes. She told me that with more pride in her voice than I think she let herself show. And I told her, honestly, that she was the one who found the crack in Elizondo's paperwork that broke the whole thing open faster than any of the lawyers managed on their own. And she should carry that pride without hedging it, because a 23-year-old who can out-diligence a room full of expensive attorneys doesn't need to be modest about it in front of her own mother. We had a dinner, the 4 of us, me, Sebastián, Valentina, and Miguelín, who I insisted come even though he tried twice to decline, telling me it wasn't his place to sit at a family table, until I told him that after 9 years and everything that had just happened, he didn't get to decide anymore what was and wasn't his place in my life.
We ate at a small place in Vallecas that does the kind of food that reminds me distantly of home. Not Colombian exactly, but honest in the same unfussy way. And Ivan called partway through from Cali, on speaker. Rosario's voice audible somewhere behind him, telling him to say something nice to his sister for once, instead of just checking that everyone survived. Valentina told the table, with more animation than I've seen from her in a year, about the exact moment she spotted Elizondo's sanction history, how she'd almost scrolled past it, how something about the notary's registration number had just felt slightly wrong, the way a delivery ticket feels slightly wrong to Miguelín when the numbers don't sit right in his gut. Sebastián raised a glass to her, actually raised it, the way you'd toast someone at a wedding, and said she'd out-lawyered a room full of actual lawyers. And she blushed and told him to stop, and didn't mean it. Miguelín, 3 glasses of wine into a dinner he almost didn't attend, told a story I'd never heard before, about the first week he worked for me, 9 years earlier, when I'd caught a mistake in a beam calculation an engineer on another crew had signed off on. A mistake that would have cost lives eventually, not immediately. The kind of mistake that shows up years later when nobody remembers whose signature is on the original drawing. He said watching me refuse to let that project continue until it was fixed watching me lose 2 weeks of schedule and a chunk of profit margin over a beam nobody else on that job site thought was worth arguing about, was the moment he decided he'd follow me to whatever company I built next, wherever it went. Por eso sabía que íbamos a ganar esto, he said, lifting his glass toward me. Porque usted nunca deja pasar una grieta. That's why I knew we were going to win this, because you never let a crack go unnoticed.
I didn't have much to say back to that. I just nodded and drank and looked around a table with my son and my daughter and the man who'd carried my oak table up 2 flights of stairs and put his back out doing it. And I thought, not for the first time that year, that whatever Fernando Ibanez had tried to take from me, he'd never once come close to touching the thing that actually mattered most. Because it was never sitting in a registry file. It was sitting at that table, in that small restaurant, laughing at Miguelin's story about a beam nobody else thought was worth the fight.
The market reopened to the public on a Saturday morning in March, 4 months after Fernando's name came off every document that mattered. And I want to tell you about that morning, because it's the closest thing to a clean ending this story actually has, even though I've already told you I don't trust clean endings. The city had put up a small stage outside the building. A councilwoman gave a short speech about neighborhood renewal that I only half listened to because I was watching the building itself. The market I'd walked through as a girl with my own memory of Cali substituting itself, involuntarily, over the memory of every Spanish market I'd worked on since. The smell of fresh bread and fish on ice. Sounds bouncing off a ceiling I'd personally verified could carry 3 times the load the original 1950s construction had ever been rated for. Miguelin stood next to me in a clean shirt he clearly didn't wear often, uncomfortable in it, glancing at his phone twice to check on a crew he'd left running a different job that morning, unable to fully switch his brain off from work, even at his own project's ribbon cutting. Valentina came, took the morning off from her firm, stood on my other side. Sebastian couldn't make it, a deadline of his own in Chamberí, and I told him not to worry about it. Meant it because I understand deadlines better than almost anyone in this city. But he called that evening and I put him on speaker while Miguelin, Valentina, and I ate dinner at the same small restaurant we'd celebrated in months earlier. And he asked me question after question about the finished building, like he was trying to build it in his head from my descriptions alone, which, being an architect, he probably was. An elderly woman stopped me outside the market that morning. Someone from the barrio I didn't recognize. Told me she remembered the building from 40 years ago, when her mother used to bring her there as a child, and thanked me, personally, for not tearing it down and putting up something modern and cold the way half of Madrid seems determined to do to its own memory these days. I told her, honestly, that tearing it down was never on the table, that renovation is harder than demolition in almost every way that matters, but it's the only option that respects what was already there. And she patted my arm and told me I understood something a lot of younger builders don't. I didn't tell her about Fernando. I didn't tell her about the folder on my table, or the 19 days, or Elizondo, or any of it. That morning wasn't for that story. That morning was for a barrio getting its market back, and for an immigrant from Cali standing in the middle of it, in her own neighborhood, having built something with her hands that would outlast every lawyer, every registry clerk, every partner who ever tried to take a piece of it that wasn't hers. I stood at the edge of the crowd for a long moment after the ribbon was cut, watching people walk through the doors for the first time, and I thought about my mother, on that porch in Cali, asking me if I was happy. I still didn't have a clean answer for her. I'm still not sure happiness and building something are the same thing for a woman like me. But standing there, that morning, watching an old woman walk into a market I'd rebuilt with my own crew's hands, I came as close to an answer as I think I ever will. I still notarize everything. If anything, I notarize more now, narrower, more specific, and I've started making Miguelín sit with me in Covadonga when I sign anything that touches the company structure. Not because I don't trust him. I trust Miguelín with things I don't trust myself with, but because I want at least one more set of eyes in this world who understands exactly what every document I sign actually permits and doesn't permit, in case the day ever comes when I'm the one sitting beside a coffin in another country, while somebody decides 8 days is exactly enough time. I never heard from Fernando Ibáñez again, not directly. I know, secondhand, through people who still move in the same rooms he moves in, that his company survived, technically, restructured, smaller, that he's still doing the golf course version of this business somewhere in Madrid, still finding contractors who can finish what he can start. What I don't know, and this is the part of this story I still turn over some nights, at the oak table, long after the office has emptied out and the street below my window has gone quiet, is what happened to the debt. The debt he told me about himself, sitting across from me at that cafe, the reason he gave, almost like an apology dressed up as an explanation, for why he needed my 40% more than he needed to keep being a man I could trust. 2 other projects gone bad, he said. Creditors running out of patience. I never found out who those creditors were, or whether he ever made them whole, or whether the 20% he tried to take from me was the first time he'd done this, or just the first time it happened to land on a woman who'd learned, the hard way, a long time before she ever met Fernando, exactly how to protect herself from it.
If you run a business, if you're building something with a partner, someone you trust, someone you like, and I hope you do like the people you work with, life's too short for the alternative. I want to leave you with the one thing that took me 25 years, 1 divorce, and a mother's funeral to fully understand. Liking someone and protecting yourself from them are not opposite instincts. I liked Fernando Ibáñez for 5 years, genuinely, and I never once stopped narrowing every document I signed with him. Those 2 things lived in me at the same time, the whole time, and people used to tell me that was cynical, that it meant I didn't really trust anyone, not even the men I called friends. They were wrong. It's not that I don't trust people. It's that I understand trust is a feeling, and authority is a fact written on paper. And a smart woman never lets the feeling do the paper's job for it. You can love your business partner. You can trust him with your Sundays, your family dinners, your worst jokes. Just don't ever hand him a signature that can move more than you've decided, in writing, in advance, with a notary who works for you and nobody else, before the day ever comes when you're not in the room to stop him. I think about the men Fernando works with now. Whether one of them is sitting somewhere tonight, the way I once did, trusting a warm handshake and a good joke told at a Chamber of Commerce dinner, with no oak table of his own, no habit of narrow, notarized paper standing between him and a folder that shows up one day with a different number on it. I hope, if that day comes for him too, that somebody taught him what my mother never had the chance to teach me directly, but taught me anyway, just by the shape of the life she lived, that survival isn't loud, and it isn't fast, and it very rarely looks like anyone applauding you at the end of it.
Most of the time, it just looks like a man alone at a table heavy enough that no one can move it while he isn't looking, going through the paperwork one more time before he turns off the light. I called Yvonne last week. No particular reason, the way I've started doing more often since my mother's funeral. And he told me the roof I paid to fix in 2011 needs work again, that 15 years is about what a roof gives you in that climate before the rains start winning again. I told him to get 3 quotes and send them to me, and he laughed and said some things about me never stop being a contractor, even 4,000 kilometers from the nearest job site. And he's right. He's not wrong about that. I don't think I know how to be anything else anymore. And most days I've made peace with that. He asked me near the end of the call, almost carefully, the way he asks things now that we've started actually talking instead of just checking in, whether I regretted any of it. Leaving, staying gone as long as I did, building a life in a country that took 19 days and a stack of notarized paper to almost let a man I trusted take away from me. I told him the truth, which is that I don't know how to separate the $200 in my sock from the woman sitting at this table right now, any more than you can separate the water from the concrete once it's cured. Whatever I regret, and there's plenty, none of it points backward at 2001. It all points at the years since. The years I spent thinking a warm handshake was the same thing as a foundation, before I learned, expensively, more than once, that it isn't. If 25 years in this business have taught me anything, it's this. A handshake is a feeling, but a notarized signature is a fact, and only one of those survives the day someone decides to lie to your face. The table's still there, center of the room. I can see the door from where I sit, and the street below the window, and everything in between, all at the same time. I just don't know, some nights, whether I'll ever again let myself believe I don't need to.